A veteran returned from war with his loyal German shepherd Duke, living paycheck to paycheck under the scorching summer sun. One sweltering afternoon, Duke darted behind a roadside diner, barking frantically. There, in the shadow of the back door, stood a barefoot girl in a faded dress, her hair tangled and eyes full of fear. In her arms, she clutched a drowsy 2-year-old boy whose cheeks were streaked with dirt and sweat. Her voice shook as she whispered, "Please, I'll wash the dishes. Just keep us together." He didn't know her story, but in that moment, he understood she had nowhere else to go, and someone out there would do anything to take her brother away. The late afternoon heat in Riverside, Montana pressed down like a heavy hand. Sunlight poured through a white haze, shimmering over the cracked asphalt of Main Street, baking the faded paint of storefronts, and turning the metal trim of parked cars too hot to touch. The air smelled faintly of hot oil drifting from Mel's Diner, the kind of small-town place where everyone knew everyone else's name, and where the ceiling fans spun lazily against the oppressive summer heat. Jake Miller, 45, walked toward the diner with the steady pace of a man who'd learned to conserve his strength under punishing conditions. At 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, and built solid from years of military service, Jake still carried himself like a Marine, not with arrogance, but with an alert readiness. His hair, once deep brown, was threaded with gray, and his tanned face bore the creases of years spent under harsh skies. A thin scar across his right cheekbone caught the light, a permanent reminder of a split second in Afghanistan, when his luck held but could just as easily have run out. He was a man of quiet habits, the kind who bowed his head over a meal even when eating alone, murmuring a prayer under his breath. Faith had been his anchor during deployments, in lonely outposts where hope felt far away. But no prayer had stopped the things that broke him. The friends he'd buried, the nights when he woke to ghosts, the day his wife, Anna, walked out. She had been the one person who had truly known him, who could see past the soldier's mask to the man beneath, but after years of living with his silences, his restless pacing, and the 1,000-yard stare he couldn't shake, she'd left. They'd never had children. That absence had become a quiet, unspoken wound, one he had learned to live with but never fully accepted. Now, the only constant in his life was Duke. Duke, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a black and tan coat, padded beside him. The dog's muscular frame moved with fluid control, his dark eyes scanning everything ahead. Duke had been a military working dog, trained to detect threats before they became deadly. On more than one occasion, he'd saved Jake's life. Now, he was retired, but still vigilant. Still Jake's partner in a quieter kind of war, surviving everyday life. They stepped into Mel's Diner, where the hum of an old air conditioning unit met the clink of silverware on plates. Sarah, the waitress on shift, was a tall, slender woman in her mid-40s, auburn hair tied back in a messy bun, pale skin dotted with freckles. She carried herself like someone who'd weathered hard years, but kept moving forward, raising 2 kids alone while juggling bills. She poured a glass of iced tea for Jake before he even asked. "Hot one today?" she said, sliding the glass toward him. Jake gave a small nod of thanks, sitting at the counter while Duke settled at his feet, panting lightly. He'd only just taken a sip when Duke's head lifted sharply. The dog's ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring. Jake had seen that look too many times to ignore it. It was the look Duke had in the seconds before finding a hidden explosive overseas. "What is it, boy?" Jake murmured, already bracing himself. Duke rose, muscles taut, and padded toward the back of the diner. Jake stood, set his glass down, and followed. The heat outside hit him like a wall, but Duke didn't hesitate. He nosed open the back door, slipping into the narrow alley behind the diner. And that's when Jake saw her. A little girl stood in the sliver of shade against the brick wall, no more than 8 years old. Her tangled blonde hair clung damply to her temples, her faded yellow sundress hanging loose over a frame too thin for her age. Her bare feet were blackened with dirt, her knees scraped. In her arms, she held a boy, 2 years old at most, his head heavy on her shoulder, his flushed cheeks streaked with sweat and grime. Her eyes, wide, watchful, and impossibly blue, flicked from Duke to Jake. He could see her trying to measure them both, weighing whether they were a threat or a lifeline. Jake's training told him to approach carefully, not because she was dangerous, but because she was fragile, and frightened children could shut down just as fast as battle-hardened men under fire. He crouched to her level, keeping his voice low. "Hey there," he said softly. "What's your name?" She shifted the boy higher in her arms, her small arms trembling with the effort. "Lily," she whispered. "This is Ben." Jake nodded, noting the way her thin shoulders shook and her chin lifted at the same time, a child's mix of fear and defiance. His chest ached unexpectedly. He'd seen this before, in war zones and refugee camps. Kids forced to grow up too soon, kids who learned that survival meant bargaining. Then her voice, soft but urgent, cut through the heavy air. "Please, I'll wash the dishes. Just keep us together." For a moment, Jake didn't breathe. The words hit him with the force of a memory, of being young and powerless, of longing for someone to promise they wouldn't walk away. It wasn't a plea for charity. It was a transaction, a deal she thought she had to make to protect what mattered most to her. Inside, something in Jake shifted. He didn't know these children, didn't know their story. But in that moment, standing in the alley with Duke at his side, and this girl clutching her brother like the world might tear him away, Jake felt the old Marine's vow rise in his chest. Leave no one behind. The drive back to Jake's place took them down a quiet stretch of county road, the late summer light slanting gold through the cottonwoods. In the passenger seat, Lily sat stiffly, her arms wrapped around Ben, as though he might vanish if she loosened her grip. Ben's head rested in the crook of her neck, his tiny fists clutching the fabric of her dress. Duke rode in the truck bed, occasionally poking his head through the sliding rear window to check on them. Jake kept his eyes on the road, aware of every small sound in the cab, the shallow rhythm of Ben's breathing, the soft rustle as Lily shifted to keep him comfortable. He didn't press her for answers. His years in the Marines had taught him that silence could be a kind of shield. His home was a modest cedar-sided cabin on the edge of town, built decades ago by his grandfather. The roof shingles were faded, the porch railings chipped, and a single rocking chair sat at an angle by the front door. He parked the truck in the gravel drive and hopped out, waiting for Duke to leap down before opening Lily's door. "Come on in," he said gently. "It's not much, but it's safe." Inside, the cabin was simple but clean. A large stone fireplace dominated the living room, its mantel lined with old photographs, mostly landscapes, and a few with Jake in uniform, arms slung around men whose names he still carried in his prayers. The scent of pine from the floorboards mixed with the faint aroma of coffee grounds from the morning pot. Lily's eyes darted around, taking in the worn couch, the bookshelf filled with dog-eared novels, the framed cross-stitch of the Lord's Prayer hanging over the dining table. Ben squirmed a little, his eyes half opening, and Duke padded over to sniff him gently before settling on the rug nearby. Jake crouched so he was at Lily's eye level. "Why don't you sit with Ben on the couch? I'll get you both something to drink." In the kitchen, he poured 2 glasses of cold water, the condensation instantly forming on the sides. When he returned, Lily had shifted Ben onto her lap, holding the cup with both hands after Jake handed it over. She drank quickly, then helped Ben take a few small sips. Only after they seemed a little more at ease did Jake sit across from them. "Lily," he said softly, "I won't push you, but if you want to tell me where you've been, it might help me keep you safe." She hesitated, glancing at Duke as if weighing whether the dog was listening too. Finally, she said, We used to live with Mama and Daddy, but after the accident, they said Mama's gone to heaven, and Daddy too. Then people came and put us in a house with other kids, then another house, then another. Some people were nice, but they said maybe I'd have to live in one place and Ben in another. Her chin trembled, but she forced the words out. "I can't let that happen." Jake felt his chest tighten. "You've been in more than one foster home?" "4, she said quietly. "We never unpack our bag because we don't stay." Ben mumbled something into her shoulder, too quiet to understand, and she smoothed his hair. Jake didn't say what he was thinking, that no child should learn to count homes instead of birthdays. Instead, he stood and said, "How about some dinner? I'm not a fancy cook, but I make a mean pot of spaghetti." The kitchen was open to the living room, so he could see them while he worked. He boiled pasta, warmed up a jar of tomato sauce, and sliced a loaf of bread. Duke sat by the counter, watching intently, his tail thumping softly. Occasionally he wandered over to Lily and Ben, resting his chin on the edge of the couch. Ben reached out once, touching Duke's ear with tentative fingers. Duke stayed perfectly still, then gave a slow wag of approval. By the time Jake set the plates on the table, the cabin was filled with the simple comfort of a home-cooked meal. Lily helped Ben into a chair, guiding the fork into his hand. They ate quietly at first, but Jake noticed the way Ben's posture relaxed after a few bites, and how Lily's eyes softened when she realized there would be enough food for both of them. After dinner, Jake showed them the small bedroom at the back of the cabin. It held a full-size bed, neatly made, with a handmade quilt his grandmother had sewn. "You two can sleep here," he said. "I'll take the couch." Lily's brow furrowed. "But it's your bed." He smiled faintly. "Beds are for kids tonight. Marines are fine on couches." She hesitated before setting Ben down on the mattress. The boy curled into the pillow without protest, clearly exhausted. Duke lay down at the foot of the bed without being told, his body forming a quiet barrier between the children and the door. Jake fetched an extra blanket for himself and returned to the living room. He spread it across the couch, switched off the overhead light, and sat in the dim glow from the porch lamp outside. His mind turned over the facts. 2 kids with no parents, shuffled from place to place, terrified of being separated. No plan, no legal right to keep them, but also no way he could send them back into that cycle tonight. From down the hall came the faintest sound, Lily humming something soft, maybe a lullaby. Jake leaned back, eyes closed, the melody stirring memories of Anna, of nights they'd talked about having children before the war had stolen too much from him. The ache in his chest was sharp, but so was the quiet sense of purpose beginning to take root. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but tonight, under this roof, they would be safe. The morning light spilled gently through the thin curtains of the cabin, bringing with it the hum of cicadas and the scent of pine from the surrounding woods. Jake had slept lightly, half listening for any sound from the back bedroom, but each time he stirred during the night, he'd heard the faint rustle of movement. Lily shifting out of bed to check on her brother. She had done it quietly, carefully, never waking him, but Jake had noticed the way her bare feet padded across the wooden floor and the low murmur of her voice as she reassured Ben in his sleep. When Jake stepped into the kitchen that morning, Lily was already awake, perched on a chair beside the table, her blonde hair tangled from sleep. She was spooning cereal into Ben's mouth with the kind of patience Jake had only seen in field medics caring for the wounded. Ben, still groggy, wore one of Jake's old t-shirts that hung nearly to his knees. Duke lay nearby, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes tracked the movement of every spoonful, tail thumping lazily when Ben took a bite. "You were up a lot last night," Jake said gently as he poured coffee into a chipped mug. Lily glanced at him but didn't stop feeding Ben. "I just need to make sure he's okay. He doesn't like the dark. Sometimes he wakes up scared." Jake took a slow sip of coffee, his mind drifting back to dusty tents overseas, where fresh-faced recruits would bolt upright at night, their eyes wide, ears ringing from distant gunfire that wasn't really there. He had been the one to sit with them, to remind them they were safe, or as safe as anyone could be in a war zone. The same haunted look he'd seen in those young men, he now saw in Lily's guarded eyes. After breakfast, Jake stepped outside to split a few logs for the firewood pile. He wasn't expecting company, but a car pulling into the gravel drive caught his attention. It was a dark blue sedan with county plates, the kind used by social services. His stomach tightened. A woman stepped out, shutting the door with deliberate care. She was in her late 30s, tall and slim, wearing a navy blouse and khaki trousers. Her dark brown hair was neatly tied back, and she carried a black leather satchel tucked under one arm. She approached with a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mr. Miller?" she asked. "That's me," Jake replied, setting the axe aside. "I'm Karen Holt with Gallatin County Child Protective Services," she said, extending a hand. Her handshake was firm, but not warm, the kind of grip that spoke of years in a job where boundaries mattered. "I received a report that 2 children may be staying here with you." Jake felt Duke shift at his side, the dog's ears pricking forward. "They're inside," he said. "Why don't you come in?" Inside, Lily immediately tensed at the sight of the stranger. She pulled Ben closer, her hand resting protectively on his small back. Karen knelt to be at eye level with her, her voice carefully measured. "Hi, Lily. Hi, Ben. I just want to talk to you both." Lily's blue eyes darted to Jake before answering. "We're fine here." Karen gave a small nod, but her gaze moved back to Jake. "Mr. Miller, these children have been in our system. Their placement was reported as disrupted 2 days ago. I need to know how they came to be here. Jake explained briefly, how he'd found them behind the diner, how Lily had been carrying Ben in the heat. He kept his voice steady, but left out the part about her plea to keep them together. He wasn't sure yet how much to trust this woman. Karen listened without interrupting, but her eyes narrowed slightly in thought. Lily and Ben have been through several foster homes in a short time. It's not ideal, but the policy is to locate a stable placement as soon as possible. She hesitated. That may mean separating them if that's in their best interest. No, Lily said sharply, her small voice cutting through the room. I told you before, I'm not leaving Ben. Karen sighed, glancing at Jake. She said this before, she murmured, almost to herself. Then, more firmly, I'm not here to make decisions today. I'm here to check on their welfare. Jake crossed his arms, his voice even, but carrying a weight that made Karen look at him directly. They're safe here. They've had breakfast, they've slept in a bed, and they've got someone looking out for them. That's more stability than they've had in weeks. Karen's eyes softened slightly. I can see that. But Mr. Miller, you understand there are procedures. I'll need to file my report, and there will be follow-ups. If you want to be considered as a placement, there's paperwork, background checks. Whatever it takes, Jake said without hesitation. Karen studied him for a moment, perhaps sensing the resolve beneath his calm tone. All right, I'll make a note that they are currently safe and together. I'll also note your willingness to provide care. She straightened, tucking her satchel under her arm. I'll be in touch soon. When she left, Duke followed her to the porch, watching until her car disappeared down the road. Jake turned back to see Lily standing in the doorway, Ben clutching her leg. Is she going to take us away? Lily asked quietly. Not if I can help it, Jake said, and he meant it. That night after dinner, he noticed Lily once again rising from bed to check on Ben. Jake, lying on the couch, listened to the soft creak of floorboards. This time, he got up and leaned in the doorway. You know, he said softly, you don't have to stay awake all night to make sure he's safe. That's my job now. Lily's eyes were shadowed in the dim light. If I don't check, bad things happen. They always do. Jake felt the weight of her words. He thought of the soldiers he'd known who slept with one eye open, never trusting the dark. He knew those scars didn't fade easily. Maybe, he said gently, but here, you can rest. Duke and I will keep watch. For a long moment she studied him, as if measuring the truth in his words. Finally she nodded, slipping back into bed beside Ben. Duke settled on the floor near the door, his presence a silent promise. Jake returned to the couch, staring at the ceiling. He knew then, with absolute certainty, that sending these children back into the system was not an option. Not for him. Not for them. 2 days later, the knock on the cabin door came just as Jake was finishing fixing the loose hinge on the back porch. The sound was sharp and deliberate, the kind that didn't belong to a neighbor or a delivery driver. Duke was on his feet instantly, ears pricked, tail rigid, a low rumble forming in his throat. Jake wiped his hands on his jeans and opened the door to find Karen Holt standing there again, the same crisp navy blouse and beige trousers as before, her dark hair pulled back neatly, though today a faint sheen of perspiration clung to her temples from the summer heat. But she wasn't alone. Next to her stood a man Jake had never seen before, but something in the set of his shoulders and the cold blue of his eyes told Jake this was no casual visitor. He was in his mid-40s, tall but leaner than Jake, with close-cropped sandy hair that had started to thin at the temples. His jaw was sharp, his cheekbones prominent, and the reddish stubble on his chin gave him a slightly unkempt look. A faint scar along the bridge of his nose suggested a break that had healed badly. He wore a short-sleeved button-down shirt, the top 2 buttons open, and his forearms were tanned and corded with muscle. There was an intensity in his gaze that felt more confrontational than curious. "Mr. Miller," Karen began, her voice even but with a tautness underneath. "This is Roy Patterson. He's Lily and Ben's maternal uncle." The name hit the air like a stone dropped in still water. Inside, Jake heard movement, Lily's hurried footsteps and the sound of a chair scraping against the floor. Roy's eyes flicked past Jake into the cabin. "I've come to see my nephew." Jake stepped slightly into the doorway, blocking the view inside. "You mean Ben?" Roy's lips pressed into a thin line. "That's right. He's family. Blood." From behind Jake, Lily appeared, holding Ben tightly against her side. The moment she saw Roy, her entire body went rigid, her small hands gripping her brother's shirt until the knuckles turned white. She didn't speak, didn't move forward. She only pulled Ben closer and dropped her gaze to the floor, her blonde hair falling like a curtain between them. Duke moved then, padding to Jake's side and positioning himself slightly ahead, his body low, the deep growl in his chest vibrating through the air. Roy's eyes narrowed at the dog. "Call him off." "He's fine," Jake said, his tone flat. "He reads people." Karen stepped in quickly. "Let's keep this civil. Mr. Patterson has filed paperwork with the county requesting custody of Ben. Given his age, the placement board considers him easier to transition. Lily's situation is more complex." Jake's eyes snapped to Karen. "You're talking about splitting them up." Karen met his gaze steadily. "I'm stating the reality of how these cases are reviewed. Ben is 2. Lily is 8 and has documented adjustment challenges from multiple placements. The board prioritizes what they see as the best chance for stable, long-term placement for each child individually." "No," Lily's voice cut through the air, sharp, shaking, but clear. She clutched Ben even tighter. "You can't take him. I told Mama I'd never let anyone take him." Roy's expression hardened. "Lily, I'm your uncle. I have a right to my nephew. I can give him a good home." Jake caught the faintest flinch from Lily, so small most people would miss it. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor. She didn't say a word to him, and Jake noticed. Not once did she look Roy in the eye. That was all the confirmation he needed that something was wrong. Karen's professional tone returned, though her eyes flicked between the adults like she was ready to step in. "Mr. Miller, Mr. Patterson's petition is being processed. Today is only an initial visit to confirm Ben's welfare and verify the current living conditions." Jake stepped aside only far enough to let Karen in. "Fine, Karen can come in. Roy stays on the porch." Roy's jaw clenched. "I have a right." "You have a pending petition." Jake cut him off, his voice edged with steel. "That's not the same thing." For a moment, it looked like Roy might argue, but Karen put a hand up in his direction. "Roy, it's better if we follow the process." Reluctantly, Roy stepped back, but his eyes stayed fixed on the small figure of Ben in Lily's arms. Inside, Karen knelt in front of the children. She asked gentle questions about how they were eating, sleeping, and whether they felt safe. Lily answered quietly, her words measured, glancing toward the door each time Roy's shadow shifted against the sunlight outside. When Karen finished her inspection, she stood and faced Jake. "I'll file my report. For now, both children remain here pending further review." Jake gave a single nod, but his gaze was already on Roy through the open door. "You're not welcome here unless it's through the proper channels." Roy's mouth curved into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We'll see about that." Then he turned and walked to his car, the gravel crunching under his boots. Karen followed, pausing at the door. "Mr. Miller, I know you're trying to protect them, but this will get more complicated before it gets simpler. Be prepared." When the car pulled away, Lily let out a breath she'd been holding. Ben, sensing the tension, buried his face against her shoulder. Duke moved closer, resting his head lightly against Lily's leg, as if to assure her she wasn't alone. Jake crouched in front of her. "He's not taking either of you, not while I'm here." Lily didn't answer, but for the first time since Roy appeared, her eyes lifted to meet his. There was fear there, yes, but also a flicker of trust. The late afternoon light slanted through the cabin windows, painting the wooden floor in long amber stripes. Outside, the cicadas droned endlessly in the heat, a sound that once might have soothed Jake, but now only served to remind him how much the world could keep turning while danger lingered quietly nearby. Duke lay at the threshold of the small bedroom where Lily and Ben rested, his body curled yet alert, ears twitching at even the faintest sound. His dark, intelligent eyes stayed fixed on the door, as if he understood that his post was not to be abandoned. Jake sat at the small kitchen table, a mug of coffee gone cold in his hands, while Lily stood nearby. She had that wary stillness again, the kind of quiet born not from shyness, but from weighing how much she dared to trust. She was wearing one of Jake's old t-shirts, the hem nearly to her knees, her hair still tangled from sleep. He could see the faint shadows under her eyes from too many restless nights. He kept his voice low. "Lily, I need you to tell me what happened before you came here. With Roy." Her small fingers tightened around the edge of the table. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then her voice emerged, hoarse, almost a whisper. One time, it was hot, really hot. Me and Ben, we were in the garage. He'd been drinking. The air smelled like old paint and something bad. He left us there for hours. Ben was crying, but he said we had to be quiet. Said he'd be back after he finished his beer. I thought Ben might stop breathing. Jake felt a heaviness settle in his chest, the kind that came before anger. Did he ever hurt you? Or Ben? She shook her head slowly. Not like hitting, but one time he told me he knew someone who'd give him money for Ben. He laughed, like it was a joke, but it didn't sound like a joke. Jake's hands tightened on the mug until his knuckles went white. He'd heard men say similar things overseas, about equipment, supplies, but never about children. That was the kind of thing that crawled under your skin and stayed there. He leaned forward, catching her gaze. You did the right thing telling me, but if we tell Miss Holt, she'll need proof. Pictures, witnesses, something. Lily's lip trembled. He'll take Ben if you don't stop him. Jake's voice was steady, but his insides burned. I won't let that happen. Later that evening, Karen Holt arrived unexpectedly, her car kicking up dust as it pulled into the gravel driveway. She stepped out in a light linen blazer over a pale blue blouse, her black hair now loose, brushing against her shoulders. The summer heat had brought a softness to her otherwise brisk demeanor, though her brown eyes still carried the unflinching steadiness of someone used to delivering hard truths. I thought you should know, she said as Jake opened the door. Roy has submitted additional statements to the board. He's pushing for a faster decision. Jake gestured for her to come in, though he noticed Duke didn't move from the bedroom door. Karen, I need to tell you something. He relayed Lily's account in detail, keeping his voice calm but leaving nothing out. The garage, the heat, the talk about selling Ben. Karen listened without interrupting, her fingers poised on the small notebook she carried. When he finished, she sighed. Jake, if I put this in the report without corroboration, it'll be treated as hearsay. You know how these things work. The board will need tangible evidence. Jake's jaw tightened. So we wait until he does something worse? Her tone softened. I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying it's the law. From the bedroom, Ben's small voice floated out, calling for Lily. She went to him, and Duke shifted to make room for her but kept his place at the door. The sight made Karen pause. That dog hasn't moved since I came in. He knows, Jake said simply. He's trained to protect. Karen hesitated before speaking again. If Duke reacts like that to Roy, it may help convince the board he's picking up on something, but again, it's not enough. Jake ran a hand over his face. Then I'll find the proof. When Karen left, the cabin grew quiet again except for the hum of the refrigerator. Jake sat on the couch, staring at the ceiling. He thought about his time in the service, about the nights in makeshift barracks where he'd lie awake, listening for the smallest sound that could mean danger. He realized this was no different. Only now, the mission wasn't for his unit. It was for two kids who had no one else. He looked over at Duke, who lifted his head just enough to meet Jake's eyes. The unspoken message was clear. We hold the line here. The evening heat still clung to the cabin like a stubborn guest, refusing to leave. Outside, the air smelled faintly of dry grass and pine, the kind of summer scent that usually meant freedom, but tonight it felt heavy. Jake sat in the worn armchair, the one with a frayed armrest and a view straight into the small kitchen. Duke lay sprawled nearby, his black and tan coat glinting under the dim overhead light, one ear cocked toward the clink of dishes. Lily was at the sink, standing on a small wooden stool Jake had pulled from the shed weeks ago. She was tall for 8, but still too short to reach the counter comfortably. Her blonde hair was tied back with a fraying blue ribbon, the same one she'd been wearing when he first saw her behind the diner. Her shoulders, narrow and bony, moved in slow, deliberate circles as she scrubbed each plate far longer than necessary. Lily, Jake called softly, it's late. You've been at that for 20 minutes. Those dishes are clean enough to eat off twice. She didn't turn. I'm almost done. He got up and leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. You're already done. Come on, time to rest. Still, she kept scrubbing, her knuckles white around the sponge. I promised, she said finally, her voice so low he almost missed it over the faint drip of the faucet. Promised what? She turned her head just enough for him to see her profile, the way her jaw trembled, though her eyes stayed fixed on the plate. I said I'd wash the dishes if you let us stay. I have to keep my word. Jake felt the words land like a stone in his chest. He stepped closer. Lily, you don't have to wash dishes to stay here. You don't have to earn a bed or a meal. That's not how this works. She set the plate down carefully, as though it might shatter if she breathed too hard. That's how it's always worked before, she murmured. Nobody keeps you unless you do something to be worth keeping. Jake crouched so they were eye level. He saw the faint freckles on her nose, the tiny scar near her eyebrow, the kind of marks life leaves behind without asking permission. Listen to me, he said gently. You don't have to prove your worth here. You're worth keeping just because you're you. You and Ben both. She searched his face for a long moment, like she wanted to believe him, but wasn't sure it was safe. Then why did everyone else make me work? He had no good answer for that. All he could do was shake his head. Because they were wrong. And I'm not them. Behind him, Duke rose and padded into the kitchen, pressing his head gently against Lily's hip. The gesture pulled a small smile from her, the first one that evening. She reached down to scratch behind his ears. He likes me, she said quietly. He trusts you, Jake corrected, and that means something. That night, after Lily and Ben had gone to bed, Jake sat at the table again, staring at the empty sink. He thought about her words, about how deep the idea had been planted in her that love had to be earned like wages. He remembered his own father, a man of few words but unshakable rules, and how Jake had once believed that respect only came after proving yourself worthy. He'd carried that belief into the Marines, where everything was transactional, effort for approval, obedience for trust. Somewhere along the way, it had seeped into his personal life too. Maybe that's why he'd driven his wife away without realizing it at the time. The next day, he decided to make an unplanned stop on the way home from a service call. He pulled into the small general store in town, the one run by a broad-shouldered man named Ed Wallace. Ed was in his late 50s with deep smile lines and a permanent sunburn on his balding head. He'd been a friend to Jake in the quiet, practical way only small-town men knew, never prying, but always ready with a tool or a cup of coffee. Hot one today, Ed said as Jake stepped inside, Duke close behind. Yeah, Jake replied, looking for something for the kids. Ed's eyebrows lifted. You mean the two you've been looking after? Word gets around. Jake half smiled. Guess it does. I want to get Lily something that's hers, not secondhand, not borrowed. They walked to the back where Ed kept a small shelf of toys and art supplies. Jake picked out a box of watercolor paints and a sketch pad. She needs to know she can just do something for fun. No payment required. Ed nodded slowly. That's a good thing to teach. When Jake gave Lily the gift later that afternoon, she blinked at it like she didn't know what to do. It's not my birthday, she said cautiously. Doesn't have to be, Jake told her. It's yours, just because. She traced the edge of the sketch pad with her finger. I can draw anything? Anything you want. For the rest of the day, she sat cross-legged on the porch, painting quietly while Ben toddled nearby, with Duke keeping an easy watch. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Jake figured maybe one day the words "I'll wash the dishes" would mean nothing more than exactly that, and not a desperate bargain for safety. The morning of the hearing broke humid and tense, the summer sun rising behind a thin veil of haze. Jake had been awake since before dawn, pacing the kitchen in his worn work boots, the scent of brewed coffee hanging in the air. Duke sat by the back door, tail thumping softly, as if sensing his handler's unease. The German Shepherd's black and tan coat gleamed in the shafts of early light, his amber eyes watchful and steady. He had been with Jake through desert nights and battlefield chaos, but today was different. Today wasn't war, but it felt like it could decide the rest of 3 lives. Jake's friend from the Marines, Daniel Harris, had driven in late the night before. Daniel was 48, built like a man who still did push-ups before breakfast, with closely cropped brown hair just beginning to silver. His face bore the sharp planes and weathered creases of someone who had seen too much, but his deep-set hazel eyes carried a quiet kindness. Daniel had been working in private security since leaving the service, and when Jake called him weeks ago, he hadn't hesitated. "Got you something?" Daniel said now, sliding a USB drive across the table. Pulled from a security camera near that trailer park. Date lines up with what Lily told you. Jake plugged it into his old laptop, the one with a cracked corner near the hinge. The grainy footage showed Roy, red-faced and shouting, gesturing wildly at a thin woman with short dark hair, Lily and Ben's mother. The audio was faint, but a few words cut through. Insurance, money, and don't care about the kids. The timestamp was just 2 months before she died. That's not all, Daniel added, handing over a printed statement. Neighbor swore he saw Roy leave Ben strapped in a car seat, in full sun, for nearly an hour. CPS was called, but Roy sweet-talked them, said it was a misunderstanding. Jake's jaw tightened. He'd seen neglect before, in refugee camps, in broken cities halfway across the world. But seeing it here, tied to these children, twisted something deep in him. This'll be enough? Daniel shrugged. Should be, but courtrooms, they're their own battlefield. Later that morning, the courthouse in the small county seat buzzed with the low hum of voices and shuffling papers. Karen, the social worker, was already there, her tall, thin frame wrapped in a light gray suit that made her look both professional and slightly brittle. She had shoulder-length brown hair streaked with early gray, and the habit of pushing her glasses up whenever she spoke. Roy arrived next, wearing a collared shirt that didn't quite hide the yellowing bruise near his jaw. His sandy hair was slicked back, but his eyes, small, restless, and pale, darted around the room like a cornered animal. When he saw Jake, his mouth curled into something halfway between a smirk and a sneer. The judge, a stout woman in her 60s named Margaret Ellison, entered with the kind of no-nonsense presence that instantly quieted the room. She wore her black robe like armor, her short silver hair framing a face carved by decades of stern decisions. The first witness was the neighbor, an older man named Bill Carter, wiry and sunburned, his hands calloused from years of farm work. He spoke plainly, without embellishment, about the day he'd seen Ben left in the sweltering car. Little guy's face was red as a beet, Bill said, shaking his head. Could have been bad if I hadn't called it in. When it was Lily's turn, Jake's stomach clenched. She wore a simple blue dress Karen had helped pick out, her blonde hair brushed smooth. Duke padded forward with her, a custom vest reading "Court Support Dog" strapped around his chest. The judge allowed it without hesitation. Lily's voice trembled at first, but Duke sat solid against her legs, and with every steady breath from the dog, she seemed to draw strength. She told the court about the garage, about the heat, about the nights she'd gone to bed hungry because Roy had locked the fridge. She spoke about how she always had to hold Ben when he cried, because no one else would. Her small hands twisted in her lap, but her gaze didn't waver. Roy's lawyer tried to trip her up, but the girl didn't falter. When asked if she was sure about what she saw, she said simply, "I remember because I thought Ben might die." The room went still. By the time Daniel's video footage was played, Roy had started to sweat. The images of him shouting at the children's mother, coupled with the neighbor's testimony, painted a damning picture. Judge Ellison leaned forward, steepling her fingers. "I've seen enough," she said finally. "Mr. Roy Miller, you are hereby denied guardianship of either child. Custody will be transferred immediately to Mr. Jacob Miller, pending completion of final adoption procedures." Jake's breath left him in a rush he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Lily turned in her seat, eyes wide, searching for his face. He nodded once, firmly. It was done. Outside, the air felt lighter. Daniel clapped Jake on the shoulder. "Told you, different kind of battlefield, but you still won." Lily knelt to hug Duke, burying her face in his fur. "We get to stay with you?" she asked Jake. "You do," Jake said, voice thick. "For good." The heat of late summer lay over the small town like a warm quilt, the scent of cut grass drifting in from the yard. Jake stood in his kitchen, sleeves rolled up, watching sunlight stream through the freshly cleaned window. The counters gleamed where he'd sanded and refinished them, and a new sink sat in place of the old rust-stained one. It wasn't much by anyone else's standards, but to him, it was the heart of something new, something worth protecting. Lily sat at the counter, her blonde hair pulled back in a loose ponytail, a smudge of flour on her cheek. She wore a yellow sundress dotted with tiny white flowers, its hem brushing her knees. Her shoulders were more relaxed now, her movements less guarded, though every so often she'd still glance toward the door, as if expecting it to open to trouble. Today, however, there was no tension in her small frame, only focus on the task at hand as she measured sugar into a mixing bowl. Across the room, Ben, now sturdier and more energetic than the day Jake first saw him, lay curled up on the couch with Duke. The German Shepherd's 5-year-old body was sprawled protectively along the cushions, his head resting on Ben's lap. His thick black and tan coat shone in the light, and his steady breathing seemed to soothe the boy into a peaceful nap. Duke occasionally flicked an ear, but didn't move, watchful even in rest. Jake moved to the counter, handing Lily a wooden spoon. "Your turn to stir," he said. She grinned, an actual grin, bright and unguarded, and began mixing. "Is it okay if I add chocolate chips?" she asked. "More than okay," Jake replied, leaning on the counter. He studied her for a moment, remembering the first time he saw her. The dirt-streaked face, the trembling voice offering to wash dishes in exchange for a home. That memory still made his chest tighten. The adoption papers had been finalized the week before. Karen had stopped by with the documents in a crisp folder, her professional demeanor softening into a genuine smile when she placed them in Jake's hands. "They're yours," she had said simply, "and I think you've been theirs for a while now." In the days that followed, Jake had thrown himself into fixing up the house, not because it needed to impress anyone, but because it needed to feel like home. He patched the squeaky floorboards, painted the bedrooms in colors Lily chose, soft blue for her, pale green for Ben, and replaced the old, flickering kitchen light with a warm pendant lamp. That afternoon, after the cookies were in the oven, Jake and Lily sat on the back porch. The air hummed with cicadas, and the distant sound of a neighbor's lawnmower carried on the breeze. Lily swung her legs idly, watching a butterfly drift over the yard. "Do we have to call it adoption?" she asked suddenly. Jake turned to her. "What would you like to call it?" She thought for a moment, her face thoughtful in the golden light. "Just family," she said finally. "That's all I wanted. Me, Ben, you, and Duke." Jake felt the sting of tears, but he smiled instead. Family it is. Later, when the cookies had cooled, they all gathered in the living room. Ben sat cross-legged on the rug, happily chewing on a piece, while Duke hovered close, tail wagging. Lily set a plate down in front of the dog, who took the treat delicately before lying back down at Ben's feet. Jake leaned against the doorway, looking at them, the boy who had learned to laugh in his sleep, the girl who had learned to smile without flinching, and the dog who had guarded them every step of the way. They were not bound by blood, but by something stronger. Choice, trust, and the quiet promise that no one would be left behind again. That summer evening, as the cicadas sang and the scent of cookies filled the small wooden house, a new chapter had begun. Not in the pages of any official document, but in the heart of a home where love had taken root. Sometimes, God's miracles don't come with trumpets or lightning from the sky. Sometimes, they come quietly, on a sweltering summer afternoon, in the shape of a weary veteran, a faithful German shepherd, and 2 children who only wanted to stay together. Jake didn't just find Lily and Ben that day. God placed them in his path so they could become a family. And maybe, somewhere in your life right now, there is a moment waiting to become someone's miracle, if you just stop long enough to see it. If this story touched your heart, share it so others might find hope too. Leave your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more stories of love, courage, and redemption. May God bless you and keep you, today and always.